Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is Jason and this plant is Streptocarpus. This is also known as the Cape Primrose and it has these lovely flowers. This plant has a long bloom season. It blooms from the spring until the fall, and if you have a crystal series variety of this plant, it may bloom the entire year. This plant originates from South Africa in the wooded mountain areas where it gets dappled shade. It likes bright indirect light and dappled shade. You can plant this indoors or outdoors, like on your patio or walkway. If you lived here in California, this plant does not like the cold. So winter, bring this inside and water it a lot less during the winter. As far as watering, you want to allow about 25% of the soil to dry in between waterings. That could be once a week, maybe twice a week. I always like to, once you've given it a full watering, give it a little lift, see what that feels like, so you know what your fully saturated soil feels like, and then when you come back and lift it maybe like a week later, you'll see that it should be a lot lighter if the roots are working correctly. In other words, if the roots are absorbing that water well. This plant is a relative of the African violet. It is not an African violet though. This is Streptocarpus. However, you can water this from below. You can also water it from above. It really just doesn't want to be sitting in soggy soil. So just make sure that you use a houseplant potting soil. That'll have some really nice drainage and porosity for there to be a really good amount of air and water in the soil at the same time, which is what this plant likes. As far as fertilizing, you want to fertilize this once a month, spring through fall. If you have the crystal series, it may bloom the entire year. Some say that they, feed it through the winter if it's still blooming. I think that's a lot of buildup of like fertilizer salts in the soil. So I would just hold off on the winter when it comes to fertilizing, and if it blooms, awesome. And if it doesn't, I mean, it's fine too. You should be getting a lot of blooms from this plant either way. I would recommend maybe once a year or every 6 months, really, and maybe do this in the warmer season when the plant's growing and really absorbing that water out of the soil. Is just really rinse the soil. In other words, like water it and like let it drain, and water it and let it drain. Do that a few times to really get some of the built up fertilizer like out of the soil, because you don't want too much. When you fertilize this, you want to use a fertilizer that's high in potash. Some people say to use tomato fertilizer. I have not done that, but I've had this since April, so I'm still relatively new with this plant. So far, it's doing well. I feel like it really liked it a little bit more outside. When I brought it home, I potted it up, and from a 4-inch to a 6-inch. Do note that this does like to be a little bit root bound, so you don't want to pot up too dramatically. You want to just go from one size to the next size. You don't want to jump sizes when it comes to potting this up, because it does like to be root bound, and that should help with the overall growth and flowering of the plant. As far as fertilizer, you can use a houseplant fertilizer. Just make sure to try to get one that's high in potash or has a good amount of it in it. If it's a really high concentration of fertilizer and potash, maybe dilute it and just use a quarter strength of it, so that you're not just oversaturating the soil with fertilizer. I don't know if this is good advice to give, but I just fertilize this, I've been fertilizing it over the last month and a half with orchid bloom formula. This is actually what you'd give your cymbidium when it's blooming. So I thought, and it is high in potash, so I just thought I'd give it a try and see if this plant would like it. So far, I think it does like it. I do think that it's nice to have a really well-balanced all-purpose house plant fertilizer used on a plant like this, just so that you're covering all your bases when it comes to the roots, the leaves, and the flowers. The fertilizer I'm using is kind of more flower oriented, but it does have all 3 elements in there. But yeah, I would just do this a little bit, maybe once in a while, use the orchid bloom fertilizer, and the rest of the time maybe use just a more balanced all-purpose indoor plant fertilizer. When it comes to repotting, do use an indoor plant potting soil. That should have the porosity and pH that you need for this plant. This plant gets about 1 foot tall by about 18 inches wide. Do note it's frost tender, so do bring it inside in the winter. And when you bring it in for the winter, make sure you water it a lot less. I would allow the soil to be about 85% dry most of the time. So say I water it, I'm not gonna really water it to try to water the soil through because it's cold inside my house and the soil will stay wet for a longer period of time. So I'll water it, maybe a quarter cup of water. And once the plant has absorbed most of that, I can water it again. And that's the winter care. Really just don't overwater. That's the biggest thing. Really watch the leaves. The plant will tell you if it's not getting enough water. Or if it's not getting enough light. Make sure it still gets that bright and direct light. Make sure not to place it in the direct path of your heater because you don't want to, toast it during the winter either. So really just keep it where it'll have a nice level of humidity, but and it gets that bright and direct light, but also there's some airflow where you have it, just not cold drafts. It doesn't like the cold. Try to keep in a very neutral spot in your house, a place that doesn't change very much. And yeah, I just think that, isn't that just gorgeous? Oh my gosh. So when it comes to repotting, repot maybe every other year. And do make sure though that either every 6 months or 12 months you're giving the soil that rinse. Don't do the rinse I had mentioned. I call it a plant bath, where you water the soil a few times and just let it drain through. Do that early in the day in the summer so that the plant can absorb all the water by the end of the day. And make sure that it has good airflow while it's absorbing all of that water. But you do want to dilute the buildup of fertilizer in the soil, especially if you're using fertilizers that are really high in potash. So, but yeah, beautiful plant, right? I think this is absolutely gorgeous. I think that's, propagation. If you wanted to propagate this, you can propagate it via leaf cuttings in the summer, where you cut the leaves up and put them in a substrate like coconut coir with a rooting hormone, cover it with a plastic bag to keep it moist, and then little plantlets will grow from the leaves. That's how you propagate it. You can also propagate this when your plant becomes too root bound, and do note they do like to be a little root bound, but at some point it will become too root bound, and you can propagate it via division of the root system. So that is another way. If you do divide this by division, allow the soil to pretty much dry out, do the division, let the wounds heal, repot the cuttings into small containers or the plantlets that you've divided, and yeah, just so that they can fill in those new containers. And remember, it wants to be a little bit pot bound because that just helps with the overall health of this plant. If you have any questions about Streptocarpus, also known as the Cape Primrose, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And if you like updates on my newest videos, please click that subscribe button. I really hope you've enjoyed this video.